Hello and good day. Today it's about Daniel 2, the statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of, and that is interpreted in different ways. And to make it short, especially the two legs of the statue, which are made of iron, are repeatedly designed for the Roman Empire, East Rome and West Rome. Today we want to look at why that cannot be, and we also want to look at an alternative that, in my opinion, the Bible shows us here. And we can find the answer to that question, who are the two legs and who are the 2 feet, who are the 10 toes, within the prophet Daniel, within the Bible. And that's why it makes no sense to look around in world's history somewhere and to look for any political structures that maybe come up. But we just have to read the Bible, especially the prophet Daniel, and we want to look at this together in the second part. As you know, in Daniel 2, there is talk of the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and he has seen a statue, and this statue consisted of a golden head and a silver breast and 2 silver arms, then a bronze-colored belly with the 2 sides in bronze, and then 2 legs of iron, and finally the 2 feet and the 10 toes of iron mixed with clay. Nebuchadnezzar has seen this picture in his dream. Later he saw a stone being torn loose from a rock without human hands, who then beats the statue to its feet and shatters this statue. The complete statue will shatter, and this stone will become a big rock that fills the whole earth. It becomes a great mountain, a great empire. And I think we can confidently interpret that to Jesus Christ, who comes at the end of time, destroys and dissolves all empires and establishes its own glorious kingdom of justice. The big question is, what is meant by these parts of the statue? Especially with the legs and the feet and the toes, we will still see that's very different from what we've been thinking if we follow the Bible. We start with a golden head at first. That is what Daniel explains in Daniel 2 in the interpretation of the dream. He says to King Nebuchadnezzar, "You, King Nebuchadnezzar, you are the golden head." That is, we may assume that the golden head stands for Babylon. In the course of the prophet Daniel, there are also other images and visions, and we can safely assume that Medo-Persia represents the silver part of the statue, the silver breast and the 2 arms, because Medo-Persia succeeded Babylon. This was the Medo-Persian double empire that followed the Babylonian empire. Then comes Alexander the Great. That would be, in the still picture of the bronze part, the bronze belly and the bronze sides. That would be a picture of Alexander the Great, who defeated Greece from Macedonia, then fought against Medo-Persia and expanded its empire almost to India, and conquered a huge empire southward far beyond Egypt. Then we come to the both legs. They are made of iron, and it's often interpreted that these 2 legs are East and West Rome. One does it in such way that one says the realm of Alexander the Great was of course followed by the great Roman Empire. And one thinks that fits quite well if one says Rome was divided due to its size in East Rome and West Rome. One then goes back to the Bible text, to the statue, and then puts that on the Roman Empire and says these 2 legs are East Rome and West Rome. The problem with the whole thing is the geographical focus of Babylon was in the Middle East. The geographic focus of the Medo-Persian Empire was in the Middle East. And the empire of Alexander the Great also lay with its geographical emphasis in the Middle East. So head, chest and belly of the statue are all in the Middle East. But if we now move the legs of the statue 2,500 kilometers to the west to Europe, to Rome, then the statue will fall over. That's very clear, and it's a pretty plausible picture. We will see more reasons why the two legs cannot be Rome, which are much more valid, but this picture should be very easy to understand for everyone. If the legs are not under the torso, not under the trunk, then no one can stand, and no statue can stand. So the statue in Daniel 2 will fall. If the statue shall not fall, the two legs must be under the torso. That is, the two legs must be found in the Middle East, where the other realms of the statue were. But if the two legs have to stand in the Middle East, then they cannot be East Rome and West Rome. And the 10 toes, which are regularly designed for European countries in our time, cannot be European states, and we would have to find a different solution for their meaning. The problem will be where and how should we place and interpret these 10 toes and these two legs. And that's the point we want to look at in the third part. We have now seen how the statue is constructed and how the statue is generally interpreted. Now let us turn to the world empires. We have said so far that the two legs cannot be East and West Rome, because the statue will fall over. If the legs are 2,500 kilometers too far to the west, and if you remove the legs from under the body, then it falls over. We said, what if we move the legs of the statue back east, where the center of gravity of the other three world empires is? And can we find something in the text of the Bible that allows a more plausible interpretation of these two legs than to interpret it to the Roman Empire? First, it should be noted that the Roman Empire is not mentioned in the book of Daniel at all. This is amazing, because the Roman Empire has naturally been a great empire. Actually, we should be able to assume that after Alexander the Great came the Roman Empire. But if we take a closer look at world history, then there was a time between the kingdom of Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire, and this time was called the time of the Diadochi kings. These Diadochi kings were essentially four kings: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus and Ptolemy. These four rulers were first generals in the empire of Alexander the Great. Then Alexander died young at the age of 33, and he left behind a pregnant woman who birthed a son shortly after his death. But the two were not able to hold together the giant empire of Alexander, and so his wife was killed and his son as well. And finally it happened that these four generals of Alexander, the Diadochis, divided the empire of Alexander among themselves. Lysimachus and Cassander lived in Greece and in the Macedonian area, more or less on the European and Asian side of the Bosporus. Seleucus and Ptolemy were settled in Asia Minor and the Near East. The Seleucids were actually the ancient Syrians. Today you would say about Syria plus some neighboring areas. The Ptolemies were today's Egyptians, or the dynasty that ruled Egypt for several centuries. And these two generals, Seleucus and Ptolemy, were the most important of the Diadochi. And if one of the two had defeated the other, then he would have succeeded Alexander the Great and thus ruled the world. That was the goal that pursued each of the two royal families. All rulers have more or less relied on Alexander the Great, believing that they were the rightful successors. However, because these two kingdoms, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, held themselves in check for many years and decades, Rome had the opportunity and also the peace and the time to become big and powerful and to intervene at some point of this conflict. To stop Antiochus Epiphanes from taking the Ptolemaic Empire and thus world domination, and to tell him that he must return home, and thus the Diadochi period was more or less over. And then Rome stepped on the world stage and became the great empire. Interesting is, as already said, that the prophet Daniel nowhere mentions the Roman Empire. All interpretations that say that the two legs of iron would represent the Roman Empire, unfortunately, as hard as that sounds, are incorrect. Or you could also say they are unfortunately wrong. Because, as we have already said, they actually pull the legs away from the statue under the body, and the statue will fall over. But now we see that there are even more weighty reasons for assuming that the Roman Empire can't be meant by these two legs. The first is, the Roman Empire is nowhere mentioned in Daniel. It's even as if Daniel wants to say that he did not forget Rome, but he doesn't mean Rome. He means the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And the second point is, and that is very interesting, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are mentioned in detail in Daniel 11, as no other world empire is mentioned in the prophet Daniel. Neither Babylon, neither Medo-Persia, and neither the kingdom of Alexander the Great. None of these three have been granted the space as the two dynasties of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in Daniel 11. This is important to note, and we can't just go over it. It is also well known that Antiochus Epiphanes is a model of the Antichrist in his capacity as the ruler who defiled the temple in Jerusalem. That's another topic, but obviously the Seleucids were very important to Daniel. At least this thought should actually make us sit up and listen. So let's ask, what world empires did God mean in his word? And which empires were mentioned? Amazingly, Rome was not mentioned. We already said that. Also not Assyria. For God did not let the statue begin with Assyria, but the statue begins with Babylon. Babylon is the golden head. Although the Assyrians played a very important role in the history of people of God, God let the statue begin with Babylon. And Daniel says that very clearly, you, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the golden head. This is a very clear indication in Daniel on Babylon. So if we come to chapter 11 and see that the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are granted such a large space, a whole chapter, then they cannot be ignored. And that is actually the second reason, and one of more reasons why we may assume that the two legs, which are made of iron, are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. God presents these two dynasties as insignificant as they have been historically seen in world history, as transitional kingdoms between the great Alexander and the great Roman Empire. So let's stick to the Bible and read on in Daniel until the end, and then these two legs appear very, very clearly in front of us. The question that still rises now is, who are the 2 feet and who are the 10 toes? And we'll look at that in the next chapter. Hello. The question we raised at the end of the last chapter was, who are in the still picture dreamed of Nebuchadnezzar the 2 feet and who are the toes? What we can say is that feet and toes are quite different from the material of the rest of the statue. We started at the golden head, then it goes over the chest area with 2 silver arms, then it's about bronze for Alexander the Great, and then it goes to iron, these iron legs for the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic kingdom, so modern Syria and Egypt, if we will. And then we come to the feet and toes, which consist of the same conglomerate. Feet and toes are both iron mixed with clay. On the one hand, this is a strong, and on the other hand, it's a weak empire. They will mingle in a human way, but they will not stick together. That is, just as clay cannot be mixed with iron, so too is this kingdom on the one hand strong, and on the other hand a weak kingdom. What we can very surprisingly expect is that in the Middle East a new Seleucid empire and a new Ptolemaic empire occur. And that is exactly what the feet symbolize on the statue, because the feet and toes follow on their legs. To the 10 toes we will come back later separately. But feet and toes are from the same conglomerate. It is also said by the feet that they are hit and crushed by the stone that is torn down from the mountain without any human intervention. That would mean that at the time when Christ comes again, the reign of those feet will be there. And it's very plausible to assert that the 2 feet are an eschatological remake of the historic Seleucid Empire and the historic Ptolemaic Empire. That is a very rough hint that we have here in this statue, but we will see later that we also know this structure with 10 toes from Revelation, from this animal with the 10 horns and the 7 heads. But we will leave that alone for now. Finally, I would like to address a topic that is very important to me, namely the question about the 10 toes. We said that if the 2 legs are not east and west, then the 10 toes cannot be European states symbolizing, as it were, the resurrected Roman Empire. But if the toes are not European states, who are they? I think it's very interesting to see who these 2 toes are. We all know the 10 toes from the Bible, but have not yet linked them to the statue in Daniel 2. It is very amazing for me to find this in the Bible. The 10 toes are the Decapolis. The Decapolis is known to us all from the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. Jesus was in Gadara and freed the obsessed Gadarene from his demons. The Decapolis was in the eyes of the Jews a very dark area. There was a lot of darkness, from pig breeding to occultism and obsession. The Decapolis existed in 10 AD to 150 AD from 10 cities, later sometimes more than 10 cities, but the name Decapolis has been preserved. All cities of the Decapolis were located east of the Jordan, except for one city, Skytopolis, which lies west of the Jordan in today's West Bank on Israeli territory. All other cities are located east of the Jordan and are all foundations of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. It was believed until the end of the 80s or the beginning of the 90s of the last century that these cities were foundations of the Romans. Since they are from 17 AD, a lot of construction has taken place. This was related to the fact that the Romans have conquered these cities and built or rebuilt at some point. In fact, later on you dug deeper and found coins and other things that clearly indicated this Greek time. Interesting to see that all 10 cities were founded by the Ptolemies, or especially by the Seleucids. If we now put the Decapolis in connection with the statue of Daniel, then there are very, very interesting connections which are astonishingly clear in the Bible. So we have the structure Babylon, Medo-Persia, Alexander the Great, then the 2 legs, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and then the feet, the 2 new rising kingdoms of the historical Seleucids and Ptolemies, and finally the toes as the Decapolis. The Decapolis and these Neo-Seleucids and Neo-Ptolemies together form the 2 feet and the toes with the Decapolis. These 2 feet and these 10 toes in the statue of Nebuchadnezzar are a symbol for the Neo-Seleucids and the Neo-Ptolemies together with the Decapolis, the 10 cities. They are made of iron mixed with clay. At the end of the day, the stone will be thrown against these feet, which will be torn down from the mountain and will set up a great empire of its own, the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now the statue is complete. It stands in front of us, no longer with your legs moved, but now both legs under the upper body, and we can continue the interpretation from head to toes. This is a very amazing result for me to be thought about. So the statue is complete. This would mean that the Roman Empire, ancient and modern, which we now know as so-called Europe, surprisingly plays no role in God's end-time history. It would mean, however, that we would expect the new Seleucid kingdom to somehow be linked to Syria in connection with the Decapolis, which would be Jordan, although I would be careful to transfer that to today's states. I think so that the structures of the Bible must also be fulfilled in this context. But I do not want to transfer this too early to the political or geopolitical structures of today, but rather stick to the Word of God. What we can probably expect is that we can suddenly see this historical structure of the diadochic kings again before our eyes, and assume that we will get a new Seleucid empire and a new Ptolemaic empire in the end time. The end-time king that is still pending is the end-timely successor of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is mentioned in Daniel 11. And a new Antiochus Epiphanes will come again in the future. That means a new end-time Antiochus occurs. It could well be that this end-timely Antiochus Epiphanes succeeds in that what his ancient predecessor could not. And what couldn't he do? The ancient Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes did not succeed in defeating his southern rival, the Ptolemy king, in order to become ruler of the world. Antiochus Epiphanes has failed, but this will succeed, this end-time Syrian, this end-time Seleucid. He will overcome Egypt and he will be the ruler of the world. The one who then re-emerges will then defeat the Egyptians or the Neo-Ptolemies, and then God's story will blend into one another with amazing accuracy. The Bible is indeed the inspired Word of God. The result of what we have now, in my view, is very interesting. In Daniel, obviously, Rome is mentioned neither in the historical nor in the end-time context. Daniel, on the other hand, directs our gaze to something completely new and something completely different, a structure that has ever been and that will suddenly be there again. This reminds us of statements from the Revelation of John of a beast that was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And that is too not Rome, but that is the structure that we see here in Daniel 2, Syria and Egypt, or to remain in the biblical context, Seleucids and Ptolemies. The Seleucids in connection with the Decapolis in recent times. There may be geopolitical changes in the Middle East over the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years. I don't know it. Nobody knows. But I am convinced that the Bible is so reliable that it also fulfills these structures that are given in the prophet of Daniel. Whether that will mean to Syria or Jordan will be split again, or whatever the Decapolis will be putting together lately, I do not know. But I see this structure which we have in mind here, and I would not like to translate that into any political context of our day, because at the moment in the Middle East it does not look like the Bible claims, but the structure is clearly visible. In one of the next chapters, let's take a look of what this structure has to do with the beast in Revelation 13 with its 7 heads and 10 horns. So thanks for watching and God bless you. Goodbye.